All right, let's go ahead. I'm Jan Ozer. This is the session on choosing a cloud encoder. And our agenda, start with what is cloud encoding, and then we'll look at the video on demand side, which is where we'll spend the bulk of our time, and then we'll look at live cloud transcoding, which has come a long way in the last even 4 or 5 months since I've looked at this subject. So with cloud encoding, either somebody builds their own encoding center and rents it to you, and Encoding.com kind of has their feet in both camps because they have their own private cloud where they can do some encoding, or they integrate with a cloud computer vendor like Amazon or Azure, and they sell the service to you. And this is the traditional bulk of the cloud encoding vendors: Encoder, Quickfire Networks, and Encoding.com as well. As I said, they play in both. Encoding.com plays in both places. And the high-level benefits of cloud encoding is lower capital expenditures, right? Because there are no capital expenditures. And then elastic scalability. So if you need to encode a bunch of files in a short period of time, you really can't do that on-premise in any way efficiently. So giving it to the cloud gives you tremendous leverage when you have to get some work done fast that was not expected. And just make the point that there's a lot of different encoding models for cloud encoding. You know, one end of the spectrum, any encoding tool can be a cloud encoder, right? Because you can lease your own cloud computer and then install an encoder up there, and then you've got a cloud encoder. So that's one end of the spectrum where you could install, Apple compressor in a cloud instance, and then that would be cloud computing. The more traditional application is software as a service, and this is where you upload your file to a service and they handle everything. You do nothing but upload your file, choose your encoding presets, and they produce for you. And this is the biggest category. A lot of direct companies, Encoding.com's Encoder. There are some that are starting to integrate with Amazon to become an Amazon service. So you buy the service from Amazon like you would other functions, and that's Telestream Vantage's approach. And then Elemental is kind of a unique situation, and they've got a platform as a service, and I'll cover what a platform as a service is in a moment. So if you want to roll your own, install your encoder in the cloud, you lease the cloud as needed. You buy the software and install it. The benefit is you have a dedicated resource. Anytime you need to encode in the cloud, the resource is there because it's your resource. And you don't have to buy hardware. So the negative is you have to run it and you have to buy the software. So although this is possible, unless you're a really, really big company, I don't see a lot of companies do this. I see them moving more towards either the platform as a service or software as a service. And then software as a service is the traditional model. That's where the service provider buys all the cloud encoding hardware they need, and all you do is upload, they encode. And your pricing is going to be based upon your commitment level, encoding speed. Some people charge extra for faster encoding speed. Some people charge a lot less for slower encoding speed. And then also whether the files are SD or HD, and I'm sure we'll start to see 4K pricing, sometime in the short term. And the benefits of the software as a service is it's simple, easy, and it's usually cheaper than buying your own hardware. The negatives of the software as a service product category is that you don't have dedicated resources. You can't reserve capacity. And I'm not saying this is a significant negative. I'm saying it's kind of a fact of life. You don't have dedicated resources. So you upload your file, and when Encoding.com gets to it, or Encoder gets to it, they start to encode it. Now, again, those are very high-quality services. There's not significant delays. But in contrast to a platform as a service, as we'll look at it in a second, in a platform as a service, you can reserve your own instances. So if you need 100% guaranteed high availability, that's not something you can really get with the software as a service. I think they deliver it 99 to 100% of the time, but they're not your resources. They're shared resources. And then with the platform as a service, and the primary vendor here is Elemental Technologies, is you reserve and pay for specific resources from the vendor. So you pay money to Elemental every month, and you reserve your own private cloud. So you send when you send files up to the cloud, they start to encode immediately because it's your cloud. You're not sharing it with anybody. And again, I'm not saying that's a significant advantage over software as a service. I'm just saying that's kind of the fundamental difference between the technologies. Again, pricing is going to be based upon commitment level. It's going to be based upon encoding speed to the extent you can buy the more cores you buy, the faster you're going to encode. And you can buy faster cores, slower cores, all the nuances of cloud encoding. The benefits are the resources are yours. As I said, they're always available. And the key benefit of this particular approach is that you can control the cloud and the appliance encodes from the same interface. So if you implement the platform as a service from Elemental, you've got one interface for both cloud and on-premise equipment. And that's a nice, if you've already got Elemental hardware, it really makes it a natural to look at Elemental Cloud if you need to augment your on-premise equipment, because one interface makes things a lot easier to run, and obviously you're going to share the same presets, share a lot of the UI. So that's a key benefit there. The negative, Elemental is it's not something you can use casually. It's not a 1 or 2 file a month solution. It's not really for the small company. They're looking for the much bigger media companies as customers. And I think there's a little bit more administration. You have to make some decisions. How many cloud encoders do we keep spinning up at all times? How do we moderate our costs? And that's something you don't think about with an encoding.com or a Quickfire. You just upload your files, they encode it, and they charge you for it. So I think it's a little bit more complicated, but not exceptionally so. And then, for anybody who's never used a cloud encoder, how does it work for VOD? It's pretty much just like YouTube. Everybody's used YouTube. You just upload your file. You get to choose your encoding profiles, unlike with YouTube. And then, you start encoding. And larger customers use an API. Some cloud encoders also offer a watch folder, which is a nice automation feature that's a little bit simpler than an API. And the biggest negative of cloud encoding, looking back, cloud encoding came upon the scene in probably 2006, 2007, and I was thinking, who the hell would use this stuff? You've got a 3 gigabyte mezzanine file here, and you're going to upload it to the cloud. It's going to take a week to produce a 600 kilobit per second file. You could do an Adobe Media Encoder in like 20 minutes. So that's kind of where it started from, and the biggest negative at the time was, upload times. It was nobody was storing their video in the cloud yet, so it didn't seem to make a lot of sense. We're seeing a lot faster upload times, as everybody knows, and we're also seeing upload times reduced by accelerator tools like Aspera. So I think, and we're going to look at this in a second, I think the math has changed in cloud encoding pretty significantly since the early days. So who should go exclusively to the cloud? And there are some business models that lend themselves to that more than others. Who should stay on-premise? And then who should augment with the cloud? Who should use kind of a hybrid on-prem cloud solution? And I think companies, there's some companies that really should look to the cloud and should never go on-premise. And those companies are, if you're receiving a lot of videos from third-party sources, right? So if your business is, if you're a UGC site and everybody uploads to you, if you're a video delivery service and people are uploading the videos to you, if the files are being uploaded anyway, then the upload lag that I talked about a moment ago is gone. If you're delivering from the cloud, either from a CDN or from Amazon, I think it makes sense to go directly to the cloud as well. And particularly if video encoding isn't a core business. I mean, video encoding is never simple, it's never easy. And to the extent that you can push it off on somebody else, I think it's always a good move. If it's your core business, if you're a big media company, I think you need to consider keeping it in-house because it adds substantial value to your business. But if it's totally ancillary to what you're doing for a living, bringing it in-house I don't think makes a lot of sense. And then as we'll cover, companies with sudden spikes in encoding needs, if all of a sudden you need to re-encode your entire library because you've got a new customer or because you need to support a new platform, that's when it really makes sense to look at cloud encoding. And then, this is what I covered or at least alluded to a second ago. In 2009, you had one 30 megabit per second mezzanine file, and everybody was distributing a single file. Adaptive streaming hadn't really come into play yet. So you'd upload one 30 megabit per second file to download a 60 kilobit per second file. And I really think cloud encoding was a stretch at that time, except for some very specific applications. In 2014, we're going to look at some tests I did a moment ago. you're producing files for multiple, you're producing adaptive streaming files. In a lot of cases, you're doing multiple sets of adaptive streaming files because you're targeting different playback targets. So if you were, so in the test that we're going to look at in a second, our mezzanine file was like 30 megabits per second, but I was producing files with a total bandwidth of 70 megabits per second. So it was more efficient for me from an upload perspective to upload the mezzanine file to the cloud, particularly if you're distributing the files from the cloud, than it would be to encode on premise and then upload the 70 megabits per second up into the cloud. So the math has totally changed for cloud encoding because of adaptive streaming and multiple targets. It's actually more efficient from an upload perspective to upload first. And of course, what else has changed is that upload bandwidths have kind of gone crazy. I mean, Scripps Network, we'll look at in a second, says they can upload a 45-minute television show mezzanine file in seconds. So, bandwidths have increased, the math has changed. The big negative of uploading to the cloud first has gone away. Who I think should stay on premise or should at least consider staying on premise? I think if you have fixed and consistent encoding needs, if you're encoding 1,000 files a week and you'll never really kind of increase that and it's a core business, I think cloud encoding can be pricey, right? People are renting you stuff, and anytime you rent, it's usually cheaper to buy. So the test project that we looked at cost $270 on Amazon. That was 10 50-minute videos to 24 presets. If you're doing 2 of those a week, that's $28,000 a year, or around $85,000 for 3 years. So you can buy some pretty decent encoding tools for that kind of coin that could handle that load. On the other hand, we're starting to see some pretty substantial price decreases in the cloud space. Amazon is no longer the cheapest cloud encoding service, and we're going to see some examples of prices that could really cut that by as much as 2/3. So if you have consistent encoding needs, I think you really do need to look at the on-prem versus cloud costs. But I think the cloud is starting to get more and more affordable as it goes along. And then this is an example of a company that, Univision is a huge network. And even though they have very consistent encoding needs, they decided to push all their encoding into the cloud. They decided, we know we're a media company, we know our needs are consistent, but it's more efficient for us to just not be in the business of encoding. Let's push that to a cloud vendor. And there's a bit.ly reference to an article on the bottom of that. That's a story I wrote for Streaming Media. It's online now. That covers a lot of the issues about companies that made decisions to go to the cloud or not to go to the cloud. Now, who should augment with the cloud? Who should look at handling spikes with cloud encoding? The next 2 pages use slides from a white paper that's on the Elemental Technologies website. And what they describe here is, a company with slowly increasing requirements over time. And they're saying, in the past, without cloud encoding, you would have to buy additional on-premise gear to supply those needs. And what they're pointing out is those black areas are times where your capacity is still insufficient. You didn't buy enough to meet the capacity you had. And that's always bad, right? Because you couldn't get your work done. And the gray areas were times where we had excess capacity, where you spent money on gear that you didn't need. And that's not good, right? Because you can always apply that cash to other places. And what Elemental is saying is, get your core of encoding that meets your consistent needs, and then use the cloud to fill in the spikes. And the cloud is never going to run out of capacity, so you're not going to have that issue. And you're never going to buy stuff you don't need because you only use the cloud when you actually need to encode the videos. So I think if you have consistent needs with spikes in your encoding demand, the cloud is just absolutely ideal. And here's some examples from the article that I referred to. Companies that were doing that, they would have consistent encoding needs, and then a new iPad would come out, and all of a sudden they needed to encode to 1080p. So they've got libraries of thousands of assets, and they can't do that on premise. It's a perfect application for the cloud. And here's another example of a company that that did the same thing. And if you're going to augment your on-premise equipment with cloud encoding, I think the easiest way to do that is to use the same. And most of the vendors now who are on-premise are also going into the cloud. I think Elemental was first, and they did a nice job getting the lead. But we're also seeing Telestream is now a service you can access on Amazon. Harmonic is a service you can access directly or with Encoding.com. So if you have their hardware, I think it's natural to look at encoding with them on the cloud because you can use the same presets. And using the same presets is a big deal, right? Because you spent a lot of time developing them and a lot of time making sure they were compatible with your targets. So I think it's a pretty significant advantage to use the same cloud vendor if you're already using their on-prem equipment. But two of the companies I spoke with, they didn't go with their on-premise encoder when they decided to go to the cloud. They went with Encoder. They liked the services, they liked the features, they liked the pricing. So I would always start by looking at the vendor who supplies my on-premise hardware. But two of the companies that I spoke to with this article I referred to decided to go with Encoder. Interestingly, both of these companies, they started using the cloud for specific types of jobs 2 or 3 years ago. They said, well, if the file's under 3 minutes, we'll encode it in the cloud because we don't have the upload lag, and it's just more efficient to do it up there than it would be on premise. Later, they both reconfigured their infrastructure to essentially make it a wash whether they encode it in the cloud or whether they encode it on premise. They basically said, we don't care anymore because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Scripps said they can upload their 45-minute mezzanine file to the cloud in seconds. So if your infrastructure is built up enough, you can kind of ignore the difference between what's on premise and what's in the cloud and base the decision of where to encode on other factors. So here are the factors we're going to look at for choosing a video-on-demand cloud encoding vendor. Integration with existing encoding infrastructure, I kind of covered that. If you've got on-premise equipment, see if your on-premise provider also has cloud capabilities. Why? Single interface for control and same presets. May not be the best solution, but it's something you should definitely consider. Some of the big differences between very small cloud vendors and some of the larger vendors is upload acceleration. Also need to make sure that the cloud encoder can retrieve and deliver the files from where the files are and where they need to be. Amazon in particular is only to and from S3 buckets. So that's kind of a pain if you're working with Azure or if you're working with other delivery, other CDNs or other places you want to send your file. And then the delivery side is, kind of covered that a bit in the last slide. But you also want to look for syndication integrations with websites like YouTube or the platform or WordPress. Once you encode your files up there, it's nice if the cloud vendor can deliver those to those services for you. And input format support is pretty important also. Again, not trying to pick on Amazon, but it's a relatively new service with some gaps. They don't support ProRes input, which is a pretty popular mezzanine format, although I think most people are probably uploading with H.264 these days rather than ProRes. But if you have any unique format needs, whether it's Avid, DNX HD, or RED, you should make sure that the cloud vendor you're considering supports them. And then the output side. You're going to see a lot of, most companies are going to support all the single file outputs. Certainly H.264. Some produce WebM, some don't. HEVC, I think, is going to become important over the next 12 to 18 months. You're seeing some companies support that now. I think Encoder and Encoding.com both supply that. But a lot of the other smaller companies don't. And then look at the adaptive side. Did they support HLS, HDS, Smooth, and Dash? Dash, again, is going to be particularly important starting in the next 12 to 18 months. If you're a broadcaster or you're captioning for other reasons, then you need to look at the caption side. And DRM is a huge differentiator between between a lot of the encoding vendors. I did a consulting project this summer that involved Widevine integration. And Encoding.com was, we looked around for most of the cloud encoding vendors, both the traditional, and the software as a service model, and then the on-prem vendors who went on the cloud, like Elemental and Harmonic. And very few, if any, of the companies supported Widevine encoding packaging for Classic, which is the Widevine older technology that's kind of being phased out. So even if the company had wanted to leave Encoding.com, they really couldn't, because it was the only cloud encoding packager that offered Widevine. And Widevine is a very useful technology because it's free. So that was a huge, if you've got DRM needs or caption needs, then you need to check that with your cloud encoding vendor early in the process. And then your interface, and the interface should match the technical capabilities of the user. I think most high-volume users are going directly to an API. If you're a lower volume user, you want to look for either a GUI or watch folder operation. Encoder in particular, has a very, very capable API, but they basically said, we're not interested in working with smaller customers. We're not going to create a UI. We're just going to go API only. And that's fine for the customers they're targeting, but if you're a smaller enterprise, want to start with cloud, that's not going to work for you. And then you want to check to the extent that you can, you want to make sure the API documentation and the API itself is going to work for your technical capabilities. OK, so now we look at the quality side. And I ran a big set of tests about 4 months ago where I tested the quality of Amazon, Elemental, Encoding.com, Quickfire, and Encoder. And this is, every service is going to say their quality is better, and every encoding tool has said their quality is better forever. What I found is that Amazon was slightly behind, and I say not commercially relevant. I mean, most people couldn't see the difference between them and any of the other vendors I just listed. And all the rest of them were very, very close. And Amazon is single pass only, which I found interesting, because 2 passes is kind of the gold standard for the top quality, and that's probably the reason they were behind. And I ran 2 quality comparisons. One was at 640 by 360, 600 kilobits per second, and then one was 720p at 800, which is very, very aggressive quality. Nobody distributes at that. I just wanted to see how they would compare. And it's you can download the PDF and look at these yourself. Not a significant amount of difference in quality. Certainly nothing anybody would see in real-time playback. And this is just my standard test file. Again, 360p at 600 kilobits per second. And from my perspective, most cloud vendors, or many cloud vendors, use X.264. So really, if you're using that technology, I think it's certainly the best technology. It's proven by a number of studies. But if you're using X.264, there's going to be a consistent quality between anybody using it, because unless you screw it up, it's going to look the same from vendor to vendor. On the other hand, some have their own codec, in particular Elemental, but Elemental has been competing with X.264 for a lot of years, going back to their on-prem stuff, and they've always delivered very, very close, if not equal quality. Long story short, at least with this go-around, I didn't see a lot of difference in quality. So I wouldn't base my choice of cloud encoding vendor based upon the quality of the video. Now, performance was a little bit of a different story. What we did here is we tested 2 50-minute files that we encoded to 24 presets, and that was 12 flash, 12 HLS. And then we tested, so that was our kind of episodic test run. And then we tested 50 30-second files to 24 presets, and that's kind of our advertising, 30-second advertising. And we ran these through the different cloud vendors at least twice, and then averaged the scores. And here's the profile we used for the various encodes, or the series of profiles that we used. And every cloud encoding vendor either created the presets for us, or I created the presets and they reviewed them. So there was a lot of interaction with the cloud vendors. The implementation varied a bit. With Elemental and Quickfire, I was able to automate the tests. And this is important because there was no input time. Basically, I pushed a button, the test started running. With Encoding.com and Encoder, they provided XML. I had to copy and paste the jobs. So that really didn't affect the encoding time of the 10 files, the 10 50-minute files. But as you'll see in a second, I think it might have affected the encoding time for the 50, 30-second files. And then with Amazon, I created all jobs via the UI and manually entered, which took even more time. So here are the results. So the top is the 10, 40 to 45-minute files, and Amazon was the slowest by far at 4 hours and 37 minutes. It took me about 6 minutes to enter the jobs, but that dropped the encoding time down to 4:31, and still it's very, very far behind all the other encoding engines. So I found that surprising. Amazon, it's their own service, and you really would have thought that they, A, they're single pass only, B, it's their service. You would have thought they would have leveraged it a lot more effectively. So I think Amazon is a good choice for people looking at low-cost options, but it's not a particularly fast encoding engine. At the other end of the spectrum, Quickfire Networks was the fastest by far. So they were done in 23 minutes, just under 24. Which was very, very, very much faster than any of the other encoding engines. And so you see the job entry time, the numbers. You see the job entry time, and you see the net encode time. And even counting that into play, Quickfire was much faster than everybody else. I should point out, Elemental is, whenever you encode with Elemental, it's kind of your decision how fast you want your encoding to be. So we chose a configuration. We had some availability of, I think it was 10 units. If we had 20 units available, that encoding time would have been twice as fast, right? So with Elemental, you buy what you want. We had to make some assumptions, and those are what we did for this particular competition. And the 50, 30-second files, there were some pretty staggeringly fast encoding times. Zencoder encoded them in 9 seconds, but it took me 6 minutes to enter the files. So they were obviously encoding while I was entering, so I can't say it would have dropped the time to 3:37, but I think it would have dropped the time significantly. And then Encoding.com would have brought it down to 17 minutes. Elemental was all automated, so that was 19, and then Quickfire was all automated, so that was 4:41. So we see a little bit of closer, or a much more narrow spread there than we did with the longer, lower number of files. Quickfire was very impressive. When we did those tests, they were just announced in the market, and we'll look at some interesting service offerings from them in a moment. Again, Amazon was much slower, but what's interesting is I don't know how many people really are going to make a decision on how many people really care whether it takes 4 hours and 31 minutes to encode their files versus 22 minutes. I think if you're a news organization or other people who really need high availability, fast turnaround, that's significant. But I think probably 90% of the companies really, it's really not going to be a huge factor to them. I mean, faster is always better, but is it going to be the most important consideration in your cloud encoding vendor? Again, if you're a news organization or other fast turn, it's going to be. If you're not, I'm not sure how important that's going to be. And then, Quickfire Quickfire again is a relatively new company. They obviously have some interesting technology from a performance perspective, and what they've recently done is they've turned that into 3 products. So one is the 10x encoding service, and that's kind of what we saw before. They'll encode their products at 10x real time with the same quality as other services, and that's what we saw in my testing. And then they have an ultra high quality mode, which they claim gives them 10 to 30% higher quality encodes. And I haven't verified this yet. This service was just made known to me in the last couple of days. So I haven't verified this. But as we'll look at in a second, if they can deliver that, it's going to be important. At the other end of the spectrum, they said, well, if we slow things down, we can afford to do it much, much cheaper. So they're they're doing bulk encoding at less than a third of the cost of Amazon. So this is relatively new stuff. Again, I haven't verified the claims, but if they can deliver the same quality at 30% of the data rate, or 30% reduction of data rate, that's going to deliver significant delivery bandwidth savings over the life of the asset. So if that's true, that's significant. But again, I haven't tested it. And then here's the pricing models. And you see a few different models. You've got cost per minute for Amazon, cost per minute for Encoder. Encoding.com and HeyWatch are both cost per gigabyte. And then Elemental is totally different. Elemental is based on the GPUs or CPU instances that you reserve, and then, of course, your usage, and to a great degree, how much you commit. I mean, if you commit to, I think it's $10,000 a month in encoding costs, that really drops your encoding significantly as compared to just doing it on the fly. So and then Quickfire is another cost per minute model. Should have made that clear here, and you can see their pricing there. It goes all the way down to, Amazon, their SD pricing is 1.5 cents per minute. Quickfire in their bulk is half a cent per minute for SD. So, and when I looked at this information back in June, I tried to put together a pricing model, and it was impossible because there were so many variables, particularly, it's relatively simple with the cost per minute people or the cost per gigabyte people, but Elemental was so, how many instances were you going to reserve? How much were you going to commit per year? It impacted the price so much that I couldn't come up with a model that I could universally apply. So pricing is going to be very, very different among all these contenders. Particularly with Quickfire at the low end and Amazon at the low end. Encoder has very aggressive pricing as well. But if you want to compare pricing, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to look at a lot of variables and then apply them differently to the different companies. So number one, you're going to have to figure out what your commitment is going to be per year, which is tough if you're using cloud for spikes, right? So then you're going to have to figure, for the companies that price per gigabyte, you're going to have to look at the size of your input files and your output files. So if you upload in ProRes, it's going to cost you a lot more than if you upload in H.264. Which sounds crazy, but that's how the model works. And if you're looking at a service that does price per minute, that's relatively simple as compared to the price per gigabyte anyway. And then one of the there's also some additional wrinkles. Encoder, if you create two separate packages with most cloud encoders, one package for Flash, one group of packages for one package of multiple files for Flash, one package of multiple files for HLS, you paid 2x, right? Each package is separate. With Encoder, since you're transmuxing, you're just you're creating the package once and then transmuxing that into another format, you only pay 25% of the original cost. So I think that's a really great feature from Encoder that really cuts their cost compared to the other vendors. And then you may have to, Encoding.com offers 4x turbo speeds that cost you an additional $2 per gigabyte. So there's also some wrinkles within the service offerings of the other companies. Long story short, very difficult to come up with apples versus apples pricing. So from my perspective, when I'm looking at cloud encoders, most important to me is, does the system need to integrate with existing encoders? The input-output side is always going to be critical. Can it retrieve and deliver files that you need? And again, on the output side, DRM is going to be a sticking point with a lot of the cloud encoding services. Make sure it meets your interface requirements, UI versus API. Gather your data for pricing estimates. And then, if performance is important, then a lot of these vendors are going to offer trials that you can test your performance, and you can also look at quality. Although, beyond the Quickfire claims of better quality at same quality at 30% file size, I think you're going to see relative equality in the quality produced by all these vendors. OK, now let's look at choosing a live transcoder. We'll take a quick look at the workflow, the key benefits, use cases, and then look at the business models. So this is live cloud transcoding. And in a lot of ways, I think this is a more compelling application for cloud encoding than VOD. We'll talk about why in a second. So the live transcoding workflow is you're on location, you've got your nice Teradek encoder, you shoot your video, and you send one stream out, say 720p at 4 megabits per second, out to the cloud. And then what the live cloud transcoder does is it, in real time, or in pretty close to real time, it re-encodes those, or that one input file, to either single or multiple adaptive groups. So in this case, what I'm showing is one file out, one group of 5 files being encoded for flash, and one group of 5 files being encoded for HLS delivery. OK, so that's in essence what live cloud transcoding is. Why do I think it's interesting? Any live event producer, what's the big problem you have if you're a live producer? It's getting the video out of the building. So especially if you're trying to produce 10 streams, here we're getting one 4 megabit per second file out of the building. That's relatively, I can do that in my office in small town Virginia. But if I tried to get the flash adaptive group and the HLS adaptive group, that might combine into 15 or 12 or 15 megabits per second. And getting that out of my building to my streaming server is going to be very difficult. So live cloud transcoding solves the biggest problem most live producers have if they're not always producing on site, right? If you're producing in a television studio, you have the bandwidth necessary to do whatever you want. On the other hand, if you're a live event producer that goes around to different places, a lot of times you're working with limited bandwidth. And live cloud transcoding really solves that problem. And also, it reduces your CapEx and your scalability because you can buy a very, very cheap encoding tool, right? The Teradek cube can produce this, it's a $500 encoder, or the VDU can produce the 720p 4 megabit per second stream. If you wanted to produce the entire adaptive group for flash and HLS, you'd be looking at a $20,000 hardware encoder. So live cloud transcoding solves the bandwidth out problem, and it really reduces the cost of the encoder. It's a significant factor if you're trying to deliver adaptively for live events. And then the use cases, again, are pretty obvious. If you've got infrequent events if you're a studio and you're producing a live show and you're encoding that day after day after day, I think you're going to have the bandwidth, and it may make sense to look at a big iron encoder. On the other hand, if you're producing episodically, once a month, twice a month, you don't want to spend $20,000 on a live encoder that you can do instead in the cloud. And then again, if you're broadcasting from sites with limited outbound bandwidth, live transcoding is a godsend. It can really let you deliver adaptive streams where you couldn't without it. So let's look at a couple of pricing models. Again, they're all going to vary, but I wanted to point out two. This is Encoder. Encoder was I want to say they were the first, if not the first or second, they were the first. And the model they're using is they're pricing on an hourly basis where the price drops with the amount of hours. So it's $10 per hour, and it's $10 per hour stream. And we'll look at the definition of what a stream is in a second. And then it drops to 7, then it drops to 5, then it drops to 4. And let me just point out, because I know this is hard to read, the handout is available on my website. So my website is Streaming Learning Center. So if you go to Streaming Learning Center, click Choosing Cloud Encoding Handout, you can download the handout I'm working from right here. So, and it drops all the way down to $4 an hour over once you're past 10,000 hours. And what is a live hour? The live hour is, and we see this on the bottom, we've got 1 hour input, and then 4 output streams, that's 5 hours. So if you had if you had a 1 hour event, with 5 output streams, it's going to cost you, at the highest cost, it's going to cost you $50. So, and then the numbers are going to go down from there. And this is another model. This is, this morning I Googled livetranscoding.com and found, yeah, I Googled live transcoding and found that there is now a livetranscoding.com, great URL. And this is their pricing. So they're charging you $12.99 a month for multi-format, $5.99 a month for single formats, and going on down there from there for Flash and iOS. So presumably, and I sent an email to the company and I haven't heard back yet, it's $1,300 a month for unlimited streaming to all those formats. That sounds a bit unusual, but I couldn't figure out how else this would be. But I'll modify the handout on the website if I hear back differently. And there are several ways to do this. You can roll your own. Wowza Media, or I guess it's Wowza Streaming Engine now, has a transcoder module. So if you want to install that in the cloud, you can create your own cloud transcoding utility, and they rent this by the day, by the week, by the month. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is through the software as a service model, or the platform as a service model, where Encoder and Elemental, some of the other people that we looked at in a moment ago, provide that service. And then choosing a live transcoder, I think the market's pretty new. It's still developing. Wowza is the only one I think you can install yourself. I may be wrong there, but if you want to install in the cloud, that's something Wowza does. I'm not aware of any other modules you can do that with. If you're choosing a software as a service, obviously if you're a VOD provider, also does live, and both Elemental and Encoder both do VOD and live, then I think that makes the decision easy. If you're choosing a live transcoder from scratch, I think you need to identify the stream requirements, the formats you need to support and the target players, how many streams you need to produce. Again, if DRM is an issue, I'd get that on the table first. You need to make sure that they're compatible with your delivery mechanism and your input sources. And then you'd start to look at things like pricing and commitment levels. And it's a brand new market, so I would definitely check references here. And most importantly, I would make sure I would run one trial event, even if it wasn't free, because there's no way to go live with a third-party service for something as mission critical as live event streaming without trying it yourself first. And here's just a partial list of some of the live cloud transcoding vendors that I saw during my research over the last couple of days. Encoder, Elemental, livetranscoding.com, StreamGuys, and Vantrix does some pretty high-end transcoding gear. Some resources that you might want to look at, the cloud versus on-premise encoding dilemma. That's the article I referred to towards the start of the presentation, and that's where we looked at the various companies who were making the decision to either encode on-premise or in the cloud. And then there's some reviews. Brightcove Video Cloud Live. Brightcove owns Encoder. They use the Encoder function to do their live cloud transcoding. We looked at that. Elemental Cloud is VOD. Encoding.com is VOD. Both those services perform very well in my tests. And then I had a webcast with YouTube Live because YouTube Live includes their own live cloud transcoding engine. So if you use YouTube Live, one of the cool things about their service is you send one stream in, they do the live transcoding, and then they send out multiple streams. So if you want to read about how that's done in YouTube, you can have that reference as well. And that's it. Any questions?
So it's Quickfire, that's their own hardware as well, correct? Not just the standard.
No, I think it works in the cloud. I mean, they're here at the show, so you can talk to them. But I think they're a traditional cloud vendor, software as a service. I think they have some of their own hardware, but I think it's I think it's running on the cloud in various places. But they're here, so I would verify that with them. Anybody else?
I would love a microphone. Hey, Jen, Joe Spizak from Intel. Hey, for the X264 settings, were you able to drill down into like whether they're using Trellis or look ahead?
Good question.
Obviously, Amazon, I don't think was, right?
Okay, good question. I mean, so well, we can hear the question because it's been, you got a microphone. But, yeah, I mean, the different vendors give you different access to their UI. So different access to those encoding controls. And you're right, I don't think Amazon does give you access to that. So even if you wanted it, you don't know what they're doing,
right,
and you couldn't change it if you did. As I recall, and actually Encoding.com and Encoder give you pretty full-featured access to their encoding engine. So you can, it's all API, it's all XML.
Right.
So you have pretty discrete control over a lot of the different encoding parameters.
So would you say it's a pretty apples to apples? I mean, I guess take Amazon out of the picture and. I mean,
well, yeah, I mean that's what I did with the test was I said, here are the presets, here are the things that we're controlling.
Okay.
So you build your presets to these parameters, and beyond this, you can do anything you want. But remember, we're gauging not only quality, but performance. Mm-hmm. So they had to come up with, and I don't think it's really important in the H.264 space, but I think it's going to be very important in the HEVC space where big differences in encoding time can create huge differences in quality. Not huge, but significant. Yep. Whereas I don't, so and that's why we let the companies build their own presets, because they decided to make that trade-off.
Got it. Cool, thanks.
Great stuff, by the way.
Thank you.
I had a question. So did you look into the hardware acceleration support for each of these live encoders and which of these guys kind of use GPU acceleration versus not? Is there any standards, things like that?
Did I look into the hardware acceleration? I did not. I've done, most of the ones I tested were the software as a service. So, I tested YouTube Live, I tested Brightcove using Encoder, and I don't even, I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what their hardware is. I don't, and it's not part of what I'm doing. The Vantrix solution will be interesting because I think theirs is, I think their thing is hardware, but I did not. Okay, thank you for coming.